This story starts with an unlikely friendship between a prison guard and the meanest man ever to be locked up. In the late 1920s, Henry Lesser lost his job as a retail clothing salesman. He was an outspoken union member, but was fired when he got a few too many people to sign up. Now, down on his luck, he turned to a friend for help who got him a job as a corrections officer at the district jail in Washington, D.C. Henry's goal was to treat each prisoner with dignity and respect. He felt compelled by the American justice system and, more importantly, everything wrong with it. He was a strong advocate for prison reform and figured the best way to promote change was from the inside. One day, he heard about a fascinating inmate living amongst them. His name was Carl Panzram, and he was in prison for rape and murder. Everyone told Henry not to go near Carl. Don't talk to him. Don't look at him. Take the long way around his cell if you can. It was like everyone warning Clarice Starling not to talk to Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. But like a child being told not to stick his hand in the cookie jar, Henry had to know who this man was. They struck up a casual conversation one afternoon, and eventually the two of them formed a close relationship, as close as you can between guard and prisoner. During their friendship, Carl tried to escape from jail, a feat he'd made a career of between 1903 and 1929, but he didn't make it very far and found himself tied up and tortured in the prison basement. Cruelty was the only consistent thing in Carl's life. Henry was the only man to ever show him any kindness. Henry slipped him pencils and pieces of paper to write his life story. Plotting his autobiography seemed to calm Carl down, and he never tried to escape again. Even though they transferred him to Leavenworth Federal Prison in Kansas, he maintained his relationship with Henry. He sent letters and pieces of his memoir for him to read, perhaps assuming that nobody else would ever see them. And when Henry opened the letters, he discovered how depraved Carl really was. The man he'd befriended was one of America's most twisted serial killers. In his own words, Carl Panzram admitted to killing 22 people, committing thousands of robberies, and sodomizing upwards of 1,000 human beings. And he wasn't the least bit sorry for any of it. He had no conscience. He didn't believe in God or the devil. He hated the human race and everyone in it, including himself. In fact, he was only sorry for two things in his world: the animals he'd mistreated and the fact that he couldn't kill the whole damn human race. Henry held on to Carl's letters and autobiography for 50 years, trying desperately to get it published. Eventually, he settled on donating them to San Diego State University, where they now sit in the Malcolm A. Love Library, labeled the Carl Panzram Papers. And what you're about to hear comes straight from the killer's confession. His murder spree began in 1920, and it all circles back to President William Taft. In August 1920, Carl broke into Taft's mansion in New Haven, Connecticut, and stole $40,000 worth of jewels and bonds. He also made off with Taft's Colt M1911 .45 caliber pistol. And Taft disputed how much the jewelry was actually worth, saying it was only a few $1,000s. Whatever it was worth, the money was enough for Carl to buy a yacht called the Akista. Carl claims to have killed 10 sailors over the next several months. He met them in New York City bars, got them drunk, and lured them back onto his boat. Then he robbed and raped them before shooting them with Taft's pistol. He dumped the bodies near the Execution Rocks lighthouse off the coast of Long Island. His sailor killing spree ended when the Akista ran aground in Atlantic City with 2 potential victims on board. They escaped with their lives, never to be heard from again. In 1921, after serving a 6-month stint for weapons in Connecticut, Carl caught a boat to South Africa, where he worked as a foreman on an oil rig in Angola for the Sinclair Oil Company. His robberies, rapes, and murders in Africa were perhaps his worst crimes. While he'd never be charged with his overseas crimes, his personal accounts are enough to make your stomach turn. While in Angola, Carl kidnapped an 11-year-old boy and killed him behind a gravel pit owned by Sinclair. Carl wrote, "His brains were coming out of his ears when I left him. he will never be any deader. From there, Carl chartered a canoe piloted by 6 African men. They were going out on a crocodile hunt, and Carl wanted in on the action, but he didn't plan on killing any crocodiles. Instead, he shot them in the back of the head and fed their bodies to the crocs. Carl arrived back in the States in 1922, where he raped and murdered 2 young boys. He beat one to death in Salem, Massachusetts, and strangled another in New Haven, Connecticut. In June 1923, he stole the NYPD police chief's boat and picked up a 15-year-old boy named George, promising him a job. Obviously, that was a lie. Carl kept George as a sex slave as he robbed and raped other men from the comfort of his stolen boat. When someone finally tried to rob him, Carl pulled a .38 caliber pistol and killed the would-be robber instead. George saw the whole thing, jumped overboard, and swam to shore. He told the police everything he knew, and they arrested Carl once again. Carl didn't stay behind bars very long. He conned his lawyer into posting bail in exchange for a stolen boat, and then skipped town once they let him out. But he got picked up a month later after breaking into a train depot outside of Manhattan. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail and confessed to crimes committed as Jeff Baldwin, one of his many aliases, who was wanted in Oregon. Carl got out in 1928 and committed several more robberies between Philly, D.C., and Baltimore. The last thing Carl ever stole was a radio and some jewelry from a dentist's home in Baltimore. He confessed to killing 3 boys since he'd been back in the States, the 2 from Salem and New Haven and a 14-year-old kid in Philly. In his papers, Carl wanted to go further before his final arrest. He cooked up 2 master plans, one to poison the New York City water supply with arsenic, and another to sink a British warship in the harbor, hoping to spark an open war between the U.S. and Great Britain. Police could only confirm the Philly murder, and Panzram was sentenced to 25 years to life at the D.C. District Jail, where he eventually befriended Henry Lesser. How does a man become as mean and angry and violent as Carl was? Was he born like that, or did a life of cruelty and hardship turn him into the person he was? He was born in East Grand Forks, Minnesota in June 1891. He was one of 8 children, 3 of which were already dead. Life wasn't easy for a farming family at the turn of the 20th century. His parents forced Carl and his siblings to work long hours on the family farm until truancy laws forced them into school. School made Carl's life even worse. Now, he had to work on the farm through the night, sometimes getting 2 hours of sleep before school in the morning. Through it all, Carl saw his family as average human beings, but he saw himself as an animal, a belief that kick-started a life of crime and cruelty. At 5, he started stealing small things and lying to his parents. Not the worst offenses in the world, but definitely a red flag. In his own words, the older he got, the meaner he got. Carl got that meanness handed right back to him. His father, mother, brother, sister, anybody stronger than him would beat him for the slightest misstep. He was weak and helpless, 2 traits he'd later look for in his victims. His father split when Carl was 7, but the abuse only escalated. At 8 years old, he was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. At 11, his worldview expanded. He realized there were other people in this world, other places other than his miserable little corner. Places where people were happy, where people had food, clean water, and families that loved them. They weren't kicked around and worked to death like Carl. Even his next-door neighbor lived like a king by comparison. Carl didn't think it was fair, so before running away from home, he broke into his neighbor's house and stole anything deemed valuable. His choices were rather revealing. He stole an apple, a piece of cake, and a pistol. And since he'd only known bitter, sour, and rotten all his life, maybe he thought it was time for a little sweetness. As for the gun, violence was about as normal as breathing to him. Maybe he was getting sick of getting kicked around. Carl didn't make it very far after the break-in. The cops caught up with the boy and sent him home, where his mother beat him half to death. The next stop was a reform school in Minnesota, but there was no reforming Carl Panzram. In his mind, the only way to reform a man is to kill him. In juvie, Carl was beaten, tortured, abused, and raped by the guards as they tried to drill religion into his head. All they did was awaken a demon. In his letters, Carl talks about how he grew to hate the guards and thus the human race. He wanted his revenge, and he'd find someone else if he couldn't take it out on those who hurt him. He lived by that code until the day he died. When he was paroled in 1906, he hopped right back into his life of robbery and violence. He wound up in a German Lutheran reform school where he'd pick fights with the other kids, but the preacher was bigger and stronger and would whip Carl with his belt whenever he stepped out of line. Fed up with the preacher, Carl stole his brother's pistol and brought it to school, hell-bent on vengeance. He came at the preacher and the two of them fought. It didn't take long for the younger, angrier Carl to gain the upper hand. While the man lay helpless on the floor, Carl pulled the trigger several times, but the gun never went off. Murder was on his mind, but he technically hadn't committed one. At least not yet. 2 weeks after trying to kill the preacher, Carl ran away to become a hobo. He was only 14, and although he didn't know it then, his life was basically half over. He spent the next year wandering around the western United States. He learned how to hop trains and travel by boxcar. He discovered how to con people, claiming to be a poor orphan who loved Jesus and needed food. Maybe those religious lessons in reform school paid off after all. Life wasn't easy, but it was better than where he came from. That is, until he hopped on a boxcar full of 4 burly homeless men. He told them he'd just come from a much cozier car, a warm one full of hay. They wanted to see for themselves, and the naive teenager led the way. They all loaded into Carl's warm car just as the train started moving. I'll bet you can guess what happened next. They took a liking to him, a real perverted liking. They told him how they'd make him rich one day and buy him all the silk underwear in the world. He just had to do them a little favor. He refused, but there was no fighting off 4 grown men in a moving train car. They had their way with him all the way to the next stop. Carl got off that train worse than he got on. His hatred for humanity grew. But his lessons in cruelty had only just begun. On his travels, he met another group of men who took a different approach to abuse him. They got him drunk on whiskey, and the rest of the evening was mostly a blur. From there, Carl vowed to travel alone and never let anyone impose their will on him again. Instead, he vowed to be the one forcing himself on others. Over and over, he blamed his abusers for the creature he became. In his words, if men don't like what they've made of me, they must put the blame where it belongs. Police caught up with Carl again, picking him up for petty theft in Montana. He wound up in another reform school where the adults in charge beat religion into him morning, noon, and night. He befriended a kid named Jimmy Benson, and the two devised a plan to escape. Jimmy's job was to escape first. While the guards were out looking for him, Carl could use the window of opportunity to skip town. Their plan worked like a charm, and the two reconnected at a meeting spot some 40 miles down the road. The first water tank east of Terry, Montana. Together, they went on a spree of arson and robbery across the Midwest until they parted ways in the early 1900s. On his own again, Carl bounced between Montana and the West Coast for a few months before joining the Army in 1907. He only lasted 2 months before ending up in military prison at Fort Leavenworth. As it turned out, the future 27th President and current Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, is the one who approved his sentence. Carl never forgot his face. As it turned out, President Taft wouldn't soon forget him either. Years of hard labor in military prison turned Carl into a strong, well-built man. He wasn't easily overtaken and could force himself on anyone at any time. In his papers, Carl writes that he was rage personified and would often rape the men he chose to rob. When the Army turned him loose, he bounced in and out of prison. He became the man of many names as he moved from cell to cell, going by Jeff Davis, Jack Allen, Jefferson Rhodes, and John O'Leary. His stays behind bars were short. Sometimes he was only sentenced to a week. Other times he simply escaped. By his own account, he was in and out of more than 100 prisons. He went abroad through the 1910s, spending time in Mexico, London, Paris, Hamburg, and Chile. He found someone to rape and rob wherever he went, arriving in New York City, where he got a sailing license. With that, he sailed to Panama on a steamship and somehow convinced a drunken sailor to help him steal a boat. As the story goes, the sailor killed everyone on board and was arrested. Carl walked free. By the time he ended up in Henry Lesser's D.C. prison, his reputation for violence was well known. Upon being transferred to Leavenworth, Carl looked at the warden in the eyes and swore to kill the first man that bothered him, a promise he planned on keeping. While working in the prison laundry room, a guard named Robert Warnke decided to poke the bear. He antagonized Carl even after repeated warnings to back off. Robert kept going and Carl beat him to death with an iron bar. That final act of violence landed him on death row. He was scheduled to be the state's first hanging in 40 years. And that was just fine with Carl. He welcomed death and patiently awaited the hangman's noose as he wrote letters back and forth to Henry. On September 5th, 1930, his reign of terror ended. As the story goes, he walked up to the gallows and spat in the executioner's face. When they placed the traditional black bag over his head, the hangman asked if he had any last words. Carl Panzram's famous last words were supposedly, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." He was 39 years old when his body was buried in the prison cemetery, marked only by his inmate number, 31614. And the only friend he ever made, Henry Lesser, went on to keep fighting for prison reform and eventually helped publish some of Carl's letters in an autobiography very fittingly titled Butchering Humanity. And that's your recap.
Thanks for hanging out with us today.
If you like getting all the crime in half the time, go ahead and tap that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss a story.
We're here Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, but don't go away. Catch up on more recaps right here, right now.
Until next time, take care.